welcome back. Please silence your phones. We now pick up this scenario 3 weeks later at the third meeting of the board on November 29th, 2019.
Thank you all for reconvening at short notice. We need to present to this board a serious new issue related to the economic fallout that is accruing over the pandemic. Let's start by getting the latest numbers and distribution from Dr. Rivers.
The CAPS pandemic continues to grow, with more than 1 million cases and an estimated 73,000 deaths worldwide. These are only estimates because many countries are having trouble keeping up with surveillance and laboratory testing. Our models are showing that with this continued rate of spread, there may be 5.5 million cases and almost 350,000 deaths in 1 month. The 3-month projection is alarming, with potential for over 30 million cases and 3 million deaths. The Americas are still the most severely affected, but there are large outbreaks occurring in many countries across the globe. Countries with limited healthcare infrastructure have seen the highest death rates so far, but healthcare systems in high-income countries are also becoming overwhelmed. Financial markets have tumbled, with all down significantly for the year. Economic disruptions are being felt across the globe.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. So now let's look at this recent exchange on GNN that focused on the economic and financial crises that are rippling around the world.
The response to the CAPS pandemic is now the most expensive international emergency ever. Political leaders around the globe are faced with many impossible dilemmas, including financial. We have 2 guests today to discuss the bottom line of catastrophic response. First up is economist Dave Gamble. Are we out of money?
The best way to answer that is no, we are not out of money yet. But the fact is we are trending in a dangerous direction and something needs to change.
You have been quite vocal about that and generated some controversy along the way.
Well, look, you know me. I try to avoid controversy. But come on, common sense says it shouldn't be controversial to suggest a response should prioritize both lives and livelihoods. Absolutely, we need to save lives. We all know someone who's been affected by CAPS. But we literally cannot afford a heavy-handed response that suffocates our economy. Pragmatism is a wise choice. I mean, what exactly are the risks and benefits of slowing air travel, of staying home from work, closing schools, disrupting supply chains, interfering with our reliable channels of communication and news? Sure, some of these steps can help slow CAPS, but often only marginally and with serious costs. When this is all over, some families, some cities will have suffered more from our interventions than from CAPS.
No question, there is a lot of suffering. Let me welcome Dr. Juan Perez to this discussion. Is Dr. Gamble wrong?
Actually, in a way, we agree. Responders, whether international organizations, governments, or even employers and families, each are weighing risks and benefits. And there is not a one-size-fits-all approach, as there are different appetites for risk. What I will say, in my mind, our response should aim to protect every life we can.
Of course it should be. But let's be frank, letting the global economy slow to a halt puts lives at risk.
Yes, but there does need to be a balance.
Okay, you both agree balance is paramount. Theoretically, that's an easy choice. But leaders are now faced with very real and very tough decisions. Just last week, traditional sources for emergency funding had exceeded their limits. As new mechanisms are being discussed, there is consideration as whether funds should primarily support health emergency response or prop up economies.
Precisely. And we do need these funds sooner rather than later. Funding shortfalls are putting lives at risk and extending this devastating crisis.
Again, we seem to agree. We cannot shortchange the health response, but I suspect we disagree when I suggest that some of these funds are best used to save jobs and critical industries. National leaders certainly have this on top of their minds during the ongoing debates.
Look, I am not an economist or a politician for that matter, but as a physician, I am comfortable saying that our health response to CAPS cannot afford to wait for an incredibly complex debate about what sounds to me like history's most expensive economic bailout.
Thank you both, and we will be watching and listening for the outcome of these vital discussions. And certainly, the market is eagerly watching for any signs of hope.
Okay, to go deeper on this, Dr. Eric Toner from our team is going to give details about the financial situation.
Thank you. The economic impacts are being felt in all countries. In fact, losses are greater in the wealthier countries despite having fewer cases. This chart shows economic projections for global per capita GDP. If trends continue, preliminary modeling from leading economists suggests there could be an 11% decline in GDP at the one-year mark into the pandemic, and a 25% fall in GDP at the two-year point when after the full effects of the pandemic are felt. There is significant uncertainty about how quickly GDP would recover, but economists fear that the pandemic could push the world into a prolonged period of significantly slower growth. Unlike recessions due to normal business cycles and market forces, a recession caused by a severe pandemic would be unprecedented in the modern age because of the huge loss of both workers and customers. The closest parallel may be the Great Depression, but the anticipated global recession due to the CAPS pandemic could be much deeper, and it could take much longer to recover. There are a number of places where financial resources could be helpful in reducing the economic impact, including public health and medical response, helping national economies, and supporting struggling businesses. But there are a lot of needs, and there's not enough money to go around. Two organizations that provide loans regularly, the World Bank and IMF, would not have enough money to get us out of this crisis. The World Bank and IMF together disperse about $185 billion per year in funds, and they've already distributed a substantial portion of that money in this crisis. Experts estimate that it would take $400 billion just to bolster the overwhelmed healthcare systems in low to middle income countries, and alone just to cope with the pandemic. To put this in perspective, the financial bailouts of Greece, Portugal, and Ireland following the European debt crisis amounted to approximately $350 billion, and that was only 3 countries. Without bailouts for national economies, economic failure in the most desperate countries could lead to collapse of national governments, which could further exacerbate the CAPS pandemic. Of course, funds are still needed to support pandemic response. In addition, there are concerns that if some highly important companies or industries fail, there could be a domino effect that undermines the already faltering economy. Many countries in the greatest need of financial support have historically been labeled as risky investments due to a combination of economic, social, and political instability. They would be at even higher risk of default now. Very rough estimates are that collectively donors, countries, foundations, international organizations may have as much as $100 billion to lend or donate over the coming year in this crisis. The question is, what is the strategy for what should the strategy for the donors be? This will require a huge and unprecedented mobilization of funds from many different sources.
Toner. So the policy question for this board now is, how should financial resources be prioritized? Experts are discussing a number of options. The first option is to direct funds to public health and healthcare systems directly in countries that are struggling to keep those systems functioning in face of the pandemic. Another option would be to use funds for pandemic response to give to companies that are doing work directly related to the response, either in the making of vaccines or pharmaceuticals, medicines, N95 masks, or others directly involved in the response. A third priority would be to direct funds towards stabilizing governments that are beginning to falter in the face of pandemics. And yet another could be to direct funds towards industries or companies that might take down the global economy in some way, in some kind of domino effect, or in some way, companies that are too big to fail. So the question here is, are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail? What is your sense of priorities? We don't have money to pay for all of these urgent problems.
Let me start.
Jane.
We need to be really clear. Unless we bring this pandemic under control, at the end of the day, the question of the economy is redundant. So prioritising what we need to spend where we need to spend it to actually get the public health interventions, and that includes the supply chain for PPE and pharmaceuticals, it seems to me is the thing we need to focus on. In truth, and I note the comment that the impact economically on developed countries has been greater than low to middle income countries, that is what has happened previously. This is not unusual. We accept that. And in truth, those developed economies, they do have still a capacity to borrow on the markets. And while some countries are very determined about having surplus budgets, there are times when you dip into your reserves and you sometimes run a deficit. So I don't think we should be prioritising and stepping into the role that domestic governments, particularly where there are competent governments in place, but we certainly should prioritise bringing the pandemic itself under control.
And I agree, and I need to add from our constituency that we need help. We need public funding to be able to expand the capacity of our antiretrovirals. Without that, we cannot meet the demand.
Okay. Other comments? Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I really think there are two questions here. One is how to find more money, and then how to best allocate that money. And on finding more money, I go back to the suggestion of G20 finance ministers, because I think it's that perspective that's needed to understand where those pools are, both nationally and internationally. David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, makes a big point that there are $15 trillion sitting in zero or negative interest rate settings at the moment. Those who are proprietors of those monies might be interested in using some of them. If it's $500 billion, that's a small portion of them, significant but small. But if that was going to stabilize or have the chance of stabilizing things such that there isn't a massive contraction of the global economy, then that might be a reasonable value proposition to put to that group. Secondly, what are the contingency capabilities of national governments? And this is an area that we found is universally lacking, which is that ability to surge finance. And some countries, because they've been hit multiple times by crises, have developed surge capacity, but many still have no ability for surge capacity. So this would be another one where you could look at national efforts to mobilize resources. Again, as Jane said, borrowing in the near term may buffer in the longer term. And then into the issue of allocation, I think that these are the right things, but I think we have an ability to draw, or would be better informed if we have evidence on where value for money is. Where are the investments that would actually make a difference? Because there is a bit of a problem in these settings, which is people see a gravy train and everybody says they need $1 billion. And then you look at the implementation capability of some of those institutions or what it is they're doing, and is there real evidence to support that those things in fact would be value added? So I think some discipline with respect to where value for money might be got along those various axes would be helpful. And
when you say value, you mean value to what end?
Value
to the ending of the pandemic?
That's right, as one, or sustaining the livelihoods, because you do have, I think this tension is a healthy tension, right? If you neglect the livelihoods, then it's going to come back and exacerbate the health crisis. So you'll have the indirect health crisis, which is what we saw in West Africa, that many more people were affected by the closure of health facilities and the shutdown of the economy and the falling of screens like that.
That's a pandemic, part of the pandemic.
Yes, George.
Yeah, I mean, we already discussed about the coordination and centralized efforts. So we think about, the system in China. It's good for the public health, actually. So even a good example for the West African outbreak of 2014 for the Ebola, and also the 2009 pandemic H1N1. So obviously, for when you centralize the fund from the government, for example, so in China, we very quickly we got enough fund to develop a new kind of vaccine for H1N1. So with 89 days, we got a new vaccine available. I mean, for